Grandy's Gift by Sarah Sparks. When Alice woke, it was early. Looking out the window, she could see a thin line of light forming behind the trees and reflecting a yellow ripple along the tidal river that flowed under the lower bridge. She watched an osprey glide high above, hover for several seconds before plunging down to rise with something twisting in its talons. An eel, perhaps. 2 eagles circled, also looking for a meal below the water. A crow called. In the distance, a transport roared along the highway. She lay in bed absently staring at the ceiling and the faded sunflower wallpaper that was curling away from the old plaster, and studied the print of 2 English setters that had hung at the foot of her bed for as long as she could remember. Maybe that was something she could take with her, although she'd already been told there wasn't a lot of room in her suitcase, or in her bedroom, or anywhere really. She had chosen her grandfather's Tilly hat as her best memento. It made her feel as if he were still around when she put it on. Alice loved her room in the back addition of the old house. It was her own private world, secret and usually undisturbed, although presently it was being intruded upon with packing boxes and clutter. What to take, what to leave. Alex thought back at the excitement she'd always feel when they'd make the turn to the street that went past the house, and she'd see the long lawns with the grandeur of the front veranda and her grandfather waiting for them. They'd turn in the lane and the car hardly would have stopped when she'd jump out and race into her grandfather's waiting arms. He'd capture her with a great big bear hug and every time would say, "Gonna squeeze you till your eyes pop out." She'd scream with laughter, and then he'd stand back and look at her. "Look how you've grown. Are they putting manure in your shoes?" Then she'd run past him and into the house that welcomed her with its familiar scent of wood smoke, old plaster, and waxed floors. It always felt like home, even more than their home in Ottawa, where her parents, Edmund and Josie, had moved so her father could find work. They were followed by Josie's younger sister, Blanche, who ended up in Montreal as an illustrator. They'd left behind their hometown, but returned every summer to the big house that had housed generations of the Gallagher family. Alice especially liked the addition. Once the living quarters for the staff that tended to the Gallagher family needs, this was her own private world, with 2 bedrooms upstairs, a small bathroom, and a tiny winding staircase that led to 2 more rooms downstairs, the back door and the main kitchen. Alice heard the back door slam, and looking out, saw her Aunt Blanche heading towards her beat-up Subaru. She was dressed in jeans and a halter top which showed off the tattoo of peonies and butterflies on her back. Her hair was tied up on her head, looking a bit like a black palm tree. Earrings of stars and moons dangled nearly to her shoulders, and multiple silver bangles on both arms glinted in the early morning sun. Blanche's employment, doing freelance illustrations for various publishers in Montreal, allowed her to take time off in the summer, so after school ended, Alice would drive back east with her to New Brunswick. Her parents, siblings, and Morris, their ancient lab, would arrive later. Adelia was in her last year of high school, and Percy, who had already graduated, would be heading to Halifax to study architecture. This arrangement suited everyone, especially Alice, because quite simply, Blanche was more fun. Alice thought back with a smile to last summer's journey, when Blanche had brought all her seedlings she'd sprouted to get an early start in the garden, her 2 cats, and a small TV in a Volkswagen Beetle. The seedlings were in the trunk, and they stopped every few hours to water them. Alice had a large red and white pinwheel dahlia between her feet, its enormous blossom like another head bobbing along with her. Their luggage, the TV, and the cats took up the back seat. They listened to pop radio, ate junk food, and played I Spy. They'd stop for a night at an old farmhouse B&B run by 2 little old ladies. It was a strange sight that met their eyes as they walked into the old Victorian living room. Doilies hung like webs on everything. the backs and arms of chairs and sofas, on the table and dangling from lampshades. An enormous moose head hung over the fireplace, and lining the walls were a disconcerting number of deer antlers. A ragged owl, its wings spread, perched on a coffee table, and what might have been their pet dog stood beside it, posed with one paw up as if hunting. When they got to their room, they'd had to smother their laughter to keep from being heard. "I think they consulted a spider and a taxidermist to do the decorating," whispered Blanche. "Do you think Dad'll stuff Morris?" They had giggled the whole night. Traveling with Blanche was always an adventure. The rest of the family would often roll their eyes with some of the things Blanche did, and said, as she also read palms, believed in ghosts, and generally wasn't like them. Alice loved hanging out with her for just that reason. She was hugely fun and kept everyone laughing, which was a welcome relief from her mother's particular organized manner of doing things. Her father was a shy, introverted man, quiet, kind, and read a great deal. There was a 5-year gap between her and Delia. Delia had stopped being fun about a year ago, and Percy was nearly grown up. Alice wondered what Blanche was doing up, as she wasn't noted for being an early riser. She decided she might as well rise and shine as well. She stretched, tossed off the quilt, and grabbed the hoodie from the floor, pausing for a minute to assess herself in the long mirror on the dresser. She studied her face closely. Just a scattering of freckles and no zits. Her hair was nice, thick, shiny, and a deep mahogany red. All the family had varying shades of their mother's red hair. She thought that it might be her best feature, her hair. The rest of her was like her father, tall, angular, and, as her mother was fond of pointing out, all knees and elbows. Turning sideways was a tad disappointing, kind of straight up and down. "Oh, well," she sighed, "I've got good hair." Normally she would have used the small back stairs to get to the kitchen, but it was an obstacle course of things to be packed. So instead, she took the door that connected her privacy with the rest of the house. She quietly padded down the carpeted hall past the bedrooms where everyone was still sound asleep. For now, everything looked the same. The antique paintings of landscapes still hung on the walls. The engravings of King Henry and Queen Victoria in their heavy dark frames presided over the stairway. She wondered if they were as unprepared as she was for the upcoming onslaught that would sweep them away like the Fundy tides. She paused for a bit at one called the Blessing of Thanksgiving, and looked at it closely. A man in priestly attire stood over the offerings of a brace of pheasants, a magnificent stag with impressive antlers, and a swan, its neck limp, its wings spread on the floor. It was the animals that interested her. How many feathers does a wing have? She wondered, as she studied the detail of the graceful bird. Even in death it was beautiful. She softly descended the wide wood staircase with the polished banister that ended at the elaborately carved newel post. When she was younger, she used to slide down it, and then had been frequently admonished by her mother to "Stop that, you'll break it," which of course was silly because the old banister had survived 7 generations of kids sliding down it. She passed through the dining room where portraits of relatives in heavy gold frames hung slightly askew, their countenances severe and dignified, as befit their station in life, for the family had once held a position of importance and prestige in the town. She entered the kitchen through the tiny hall that connected it to the dining room. The kitchen was a total mess. Food and utensils were scattered about. Boxes, full and empty, were everywhere. Things were either being put in or taken out, and no one could find what they wanted from one day to the next. It was all very confusing and didn't seem to make much sense. She found the toaster behind a stack of old books, popped in a couple of slices of brown bread, then went in search for the cinnamon, finally finding it in a box marked spice. Alice thought it a bit premature to pack the cinnamon. The toast popped and she buttered it at the table, resting her bare feet on the rung, worn nearly through by others before her. She took a pencil out of the jar on the table and started to sketch the swan on the lined spiraled notebook that her mother had lists on. Did all the birds have the same number of feathers in their wings, she wondered. She tried to envision the swan. Wings were hard. She erased the wings, tried to redraw them, but now it was smudged and blurry. Frustrated, she put the notebook back on the pile of papers on the table. She rested her chin in her hands and sighed. The auction would be in a few days, as would her 13th birthday. But it seemed everyone was so focused on getting ready for the auction that no one seemed to be thinking of her birthday. She poured herself some orange juice and went back to the dining room, where once a huge mahogany table had filled the space. It had sold months back now. The sideboards occupied the space to display more rare figurines and dishes. Royal Dalton, Crown Derby, antlered-handled carving knives, crystal bowls, and candelabras. It felt strange standing in there, like the dining room had been turned into an antique store. She could hear movements upstairs, voices muffled, a thud of someone getting out of bed. It was probably her brother Percy, who was usually up first and always in an annoyingly good mood. She heard him coming down the stairs. Thud, 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 thud. He jumped the last two at the bottom, and all the china quivered. "Don't do that, Percy." "Morning, Alley-oop." He grinned at her disapproval as he breezed by her to the pantry and ruffled her hair as he did so. "Don't do that either." He found one of the larger mugs and went to make coffee. "Did you mark what you wanted to take? Make sure you did, because when the auctioneers come, we'll move our stuff out of the way so it doesn't get mixed up. Here's the stickers." "I already did." "Well, I'm just saying make sure, because this is it, you know? This is it." "I know." A tinge of anger rose in her tone. She stood a while in the dining room as Percy rummaged around in the kitchen. "Where's the coffee?" "Who knows?" "Why on earth would Josie pack that?" "Who knows?" "Well, she should wait until we're done here. I mean, good grief." Alice was half listening as she gazed on the collection of figurines on display. There was a small one of a mouse on a spool of thread. "That's cute," she thought, and tucked it into her pajama pocket. She really didn't know what to mark as most important to her. There was, however, one item she thought would be very cool to have. It was a glass box that sat on top of the bookcase in the study. It encased small stuffed animals, birds and butterflies. There was a red squirrel in one corner and a woodpecker in the other. The background was painted with ferns. She really wanted it, but her mother was adamant. "Absolutely not. I'll not bring that disgusting collection in the house." So that was that. What did her mother have against stuffed animals, she wondered. Her grandfather's Tilly hat was the one item she actually wanted. What was the point in putting stickers on stuff that she didn't want? Right now, however, her mother was walking the high wire line of tension, and any disagreement whatsoever was to be avoided at all costs. There had been several meltdowns. Mostly, Alice just stayed out of the way so as not to be caught in her mother's organizational frenzy. It sounded like her parents were also getting up. She decided it would be a good idea to vacate the kitchen scene before her mother got downstairs. "Where's the cereal?" "Who knows?" Time to get along while the going was good. Alice trotted quickly up the stairs, but paused once again at Thanksgiving blessing. She started to count the swan's wing feathers, but gave up. There were a lot. She decided that wings might be too hard to draw. She continued down past her still sleeping sister's room. Her name was Adelia, but everyone left off the A. Queen Delia, Queen D for short, but not to her face. At 17, Delia was beautiful, with strawberry blonde hair, brilliant blue eyes, a range of radical mood swings from silly and endearing to hysterical monster. These days, Alice wondered if perhaps some alien life form had taken over Delia's brain, like in the Body Snatchers. She met her parents, still in their housecoats, coming down the hall towards her. Morris, panting, hobbled along with them. His eyes were clouded and the hair on his muzzle was pure white, but he always seemed to be grinning. He never left her father's side. He must be 100 in dog years, thought Alice, giving him a pat as he shuffled past. Morris sneezed in appreciation and looked up at her with nothing but dog love in his old blind eyes. He smelled, but that didn't bother anyone. He was family. Both of her parents were tall. Her mother's auburn hair was gathered back with a clip and slightly tangled. There were circles under her eyes. She looked tired. "Morning, sweetheart. Did you have breakfast?" Mother asked as she swept past her. "Toast and OJ. Percy's downstairs." "Good girl," said her father, in much the same way he spoke to the dog. "Don't forget to put your stickers on things you want." "I already did." "Well, just make sure, 'cause you know, after tomorrow," her father's voice trailed off as he descended the stairs. Alice slowly continued down the hall past her sister's room. The door was shut with "Do Not Disturb" written in large letters with magic marker on a piece of paper pinned on it. "No problem, Delia. Won't be knocking on that door any time soon," Alice thought to herself. To wake up the sleeping tiger would bring the wrath of several demons, so she made sure not to even squeak a floorboard. Her mother said that it was a stage, but no one seemed to know when it was going to be over. Alice pondered on her own approaching teen years. Maybe that was why no one had as yet said anything about her birthday. Maybe they were also worried she might become totally obnoxious overnight, although that hadn't happened with Percy, who was only a year older than Delia. His easygoing nature kind of countered his hypersensitive sister's regime of terror. What was it going to be like when he was off at college? She put that thought out of her mind as she opened the door to the addition and her private world. She stepped into her room and flopped on the old fold-out cot and held the China mouse up to look at it. It was cute, sitting on a spool of thread reading a newspaper. She remembered a story about some mice that had finished a coat for a tailor when he had fallen asleep and left it incomplete. It was to be ready for the king the next day. The mice had left a note that they had run out of thread to finish a buttonhole. The book was in the library somewhere. Maybe she should look for it. It was a nice story that Josie had read to her when she was little. She put the little figurine on the dresser beside her and looked out the window onto the lawns and the water beyond them and contemplated what was happening. From downstairs she could hear her parents chatting with her brother Percy. Her mother was already in organizational mode. Best to steer clear of that for a while. In a couple of days, everything would be different. Alice let the memories of last year's summer float through her mind. Gatherings of relatives coming to visit. Games of tag and croquet on the spacious lawns. Blanche and Josie bringing out bowls of potato salad, rolls, coleslaw, sliced ham, and food others brought for the potluck meal. Everyone laughing. Grandy telling stories to all the kids. Then later, the adults sat around talking while the kids trooped into the house to explore the rooms and discover treasures. There were top hats and lace petticoats, a portable gramophone, a rocking horse with real horsehair and a leather saddle. Beaded purses, long nightgowns with lace ruffles, toys and trinkets. They'd find dress-ups of fabulous ball gowns in old trunks and parade up and down the halls trailing long beaded skirts or play hide-and-seek through the endless rooms with enormous closets. No one told them not to touch anything or to stop running or making noise. The endless summer days passed with family picnics, bonfires, toasted marshmallows, and hot dogs. Exploring the rough rock beaches where little shy crabs hid in the mounds of seaweed and tidal pools were decorated with blue mussel shells and periwinkles. She'd waded in the icy salt water, her hair blowing in the cool ocean breezes. When night came, she'd fallen into bed exhausted, lulled to sleep by the sound of the foghorn, to awaken to another day of endless play and freedom. Alice couldn't have imagined spending summer anywhere else, or the changes that were to happen. Then this time last year, just as they were packing and getting ready to leave, Grandy had fallen while doing some gardening. Josie had called the ambulance, and they all watched anxiously as they loaded her grandfather in on a stretcher, but he'd smiled and managed to raise a hand to let them know he was okay. Blanche and Josie had followed the ambulance to the hospital and had called to let everyone know that Grandy was checked in and in good spirits. They said that it had been his heart, but that his chances were good for recovery. The doctor said they could all come up the next morning to visit, when they would have more to tell them. They had returned home that afternoon looking relieved. The whole family had pitched in to get supper, and although worried, they were looking forward to heading up the next day. Later that evening, the phone had rung. Alice went into the kitchen just as her mother was hanging up. She turned to look at Alice. There were tears in her eyes, and her voice shook a bit when she said, "Go get the others, Alice. There's been some bad news." They sat quietly at the table as Josie told them how Grandy had seemed fine. He had had something to eat, said he was tired, and closed his eyes. He passed gently in his sleep. He was 94. The service at the church was crowded with everyone from town, and after the funeral, the Gallagher house filled with what seemed like 1,000,000 people coming to pay their respects. A lace tablecloth covered the table, with trays of food and flowers everywhere. Alice kept expecting to see Grandy come over to his old friends and shake their hands, tell stories, and hear his laugh. It was like a big party, only the guest of honor was missing. Later that afternoon, everyone had gone. She had overheard her mother talking with Sister Blanche about the house. Alice burst into the room in tears. "You can't! You can't!" "But we have to, Alice. It's just too much for us to keep up."